Hello, this is Laura Lyons with SonarMed, and we're here today for Module 2, Getting Started, using the SonarMed Airwave in the NICU. So today we'll talk about calibration and assembly, how you put it together. We're going to talk about how you confirm the position of the endotracheal tube. How do you set baseline? If you've cut the endotracheal tube, which very often is done in the neonatal intensive care, how to modify the length on the monitor. Setting alarms and setting them so that they count and they matter. Also setting sound speed correction if necessary, and then getting ready and beginning to monitor. So the first thing is you want to choose the right sensor, and you will see the label on each sensor. You've got a 2.5, 3.0, and a 3.5 here. Sensors are the same sizes, but the nozzles differ because they're going to go directly on the endotracheal tube. So make sure you pick the right size and then get started. To do a quick calibration, and you only have to do this at the beginning, you're going to connect the cable and put that on the monitor and then put it on your sensor. So connect the cable to the monitor and then into the sensor. You'll turn your monitor on. And then you'll see a question that says system calibration. Do we want a new calibration? Well, if I've got a new patient, absolutely the answer is yes. And I'm going to push that oval button, that blue oval button on the right to say yes. If for any reason you were suspending monitoring or you were, the cable became disconnected, then the answer would be no. But in this case, we're talking about calibrating with a new patient. So step one is to choose the size of endotracheal tube you're using. At the bottom, you'll see where it says 3.0 millimeter ID. So this would be an example of when I'm using the SonarMed Airwave on a 3.0 endotracheal tube. So I choose that size, and if I need to change that, I use my up and down arrows. I center enter to turn that editable, which is a white box, and I use my up or down arrows to choose the appropriate size. Once I've done that, I will get a screen that says, are you sure this is a 3.0? And so I'm going to step 2, confirm it by pushing the button next to the checkbox. A very quick calibration. Next, I'm going to see a screen that asks me what type of endotracheal tubes do I have. Mostly you're going to see a Mallinckrodt. That's what the large part of the market share is. But there are others loaded as well, and you're going to use your up and down arrows to find your type of endotracheal tube. When in doubt, simply select Mallinckrodt. Once you've selected it, it asks you to confirm it. Message the calibration is complete. And now it's ready, and you're going to connect the sensor directly to the endotracheal tube. So let's talk a little bit about that assembly. As we said, the sensor connects directly to the endotracheal tube, which typically is going to mean that if you already have your Y hooked up for your suction, you will remove that and you're going to put that into our adapter at the 15 millimeter connector. So the picture's on the bottom. You see our adapter on the left and the Y on that first photograph on the left. Then you see the two put together. And then you see the third picture is where you have the SonarMed Airwave sensor connected directly to the endotracheal tube, and then you have your Y and your section to the left of that. So how do we confirm that the endotracheal tube is in a good position using the airway? The first thing I want to do is go to my waveform. I'm going to do that by selecting that icon that looks like the waveform and using that oval button to get there. Now I get into the waveform screen, and we'll have a lot of training about this later on, but what we're looking at right now is that echo right there in that blue-gray box. Do you see the box on the right and the circle, that downward echo, kind of like a V? That's the echo that's coming from the lung. And we're going to make sure that that's in the position that we want it to be in. Basically right now, if you see the tick marks at the bottom, those are centimeters. And so I know that that tube is just maybe a centimeter and a half to 2 centimeters above the carina. Nicely placed. So next I go back to my main screen, and then I want to start monitoring. So I'm going to select Go. Once I do that, it's going to ask me a question. Hey, have you already cut that tube? Because if you have, you need to change the length of the tube. And then I want to set baseline by pushing the button and confirming that I've set baseline. You do this at the very beginning, and basically what you're saying is this is where the end of the tip of the endotracheal tube is at this time. If after you set the baseline, you cut the tube, then go back and enter that correct length later on. How would I modify the length of the endotracheal tube? We're going to again use that waveform screen, and if you remember, that's that bottom right oval button is going to take us to the waveform. Now I see a bunch of echoes and things that are going on, but I want to use my right arrow, so I hit my right arrow and then immediately hit the center button for enter. This little box pops up that says modify ETT length. I've cut it, so I'm going to use my down arrow to go down to where I've centered the echo in the tip or millimeter window. When you do that, there's a little green dot that goes at the very bottom of that echo in that red box in the middle. So there's the buttons that you use to make the changes. That shows you that you were changing the length. See the red circle at the top? And here's what we're moving. Once it's moved, it looks like this. So again, you see the yellow in the left, and as I decrease the size of the length of my endotracheal tube, I now have the echo in that red box with the green little circle at the very bottom. I use my back arrow at the top, that's that top oval button, and I'm going to confirm, okay? And it's really important that we're going to start monitoring now. It's really important that the only time you reset the baseline is that we purposefully reposition the endotracheal tube. That's the only time you're going to reset a baseline. So how do we make alarms matter? This is a big deal, right? So let's talk first about how we get into the alarm settings. You're going to use this icon at the top, and that's like the gear kind of on our cell phones, right? So I go into my settings screen, and this is what I see in that main menu settings screen. There's your alarm settings, okay? And so that's where I can set my alarms. When I'm finished, I go out. And we have looked at how we recommend setting your up and down movement alarms, and looked at a lot of the literature. And basically what we have determined is that gold standard is you want the tip of the endotracheal tube to be at least 1 centimeter above the carina and at least 1.4 below the vocal cords. Anything outside of that is a critical position, but if you're in your safe zone, which you see in the box on the right and the tracheus, that safe zone, the safe zone is 1.5 centimeters below the cords and 1 centimeter above the carina. Now, your alarms, though, are going to vary based on the size of your endotracheal tube, and basically that's based on the average length trachea. So if I look at a baby that has a 2.5 trachea, ETT size, typically the trachea length is 4.0 centimeters. So the average length of a tiny baby is 4.0 centimeters. By the time they have a big enough to have a 3.5, the average length of their trachea is 5.5 centimeters. And so we give you alarm recommendations to go with that, depending on where the tip of the tube is, and once it's in the safe zone, how much movement you can have before it's a problem. So again, you consider the size of the baby, the position of the endotracheal tube, and you want to detect critical movements, anything that goes out of our safe zone and into an unsafe zone. So this is your alarm screen. We showed you a minute ago how to get in there. And what you see highlighted right now is a 1.0 and a red arrow up. And what that means is that I'm going to alarm at this point if my endotracheal tube moves up more than 1 centimeter. And I have alarms for movement, obstruction. I have alarms for passageway size. And I can also set my volume here. Once I've made my changes, and again I use my right, left, up, down navigational buttons, and I center for enter. I want to accept my changes. They are then there. If you have a monitor in front of you, take a minute now to play around with it and set the alarms as you see right here. You want to set movement to up to 1.2, movement down 0.8 centimeters, a 50% obstruction, alarm volume at 9, passageway smaller at 45 and passageway larger at 45. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. You can always pause this video as well if you want a little extra time. And remember, once you've done that, you're going to want to confirm the changes you made. So here's another exercise. If you have a baby that has a 3.0 millimeter endotracheal tube, and the tube is roughly 1.4 above the carina, and the baby's an average size for a 3.0, right? So how would you set the alarms, and how would you justify how you set your up and down movement alarms? So think that through as well. Sound speed correction, and this is a setting that you may need to use from time to time, probably not very often in the NICU, but it's going to compensate for the changes in the speed of sound caused by a higher FiO2. So if I have my oxygen set at above 60%, then I need to make a correction. I can do that in two different ways. I can do it on the waveform screen or in the settings screen. The waveform screen is where it's the easiest to do, and it's very similar to setting your tube length, and you just have a few pushes of the buttons and you're able to set that and change that. The only time you need to do that is if you place your baby on above 60% for an extended period of time. So if you're just giving them a little extra oxygen while you suction, you would not make changes there. So once we've looked at all that, we're going to begin monitoring. And this next slide, you're actually going to see a video.
So now we're going to set up the device to be used on a neonatal patient. The first thing we'll do is connect the cable, the sensor cable, to the monitor itself. And you can see when we do that, the screen pops up asking us if we're using a new sensor. We then will snap the cable into place on the neonatal sensor so that there's a connection between the sensor and the monitor. When you look at the monitor, you'll see first that the screen's changed to indicate that there's a new sensor once we plug the cable in. And there's 3 blue buttons that correspond to the different actions to the left of them. Because we're using a new sensor, we want to check the green check, which would mean we would hit the button just to the right of that green check. Now the device is asking us for the size of the endotrach tube that we're using. It currently is set for a 6.5 millimeter tube, and we're going to be using a 3 millimeter tube on this baby. So we'll use the control buttons over here to the far right. These will increase and decrease. These will move the cursor left and right, and this is our enter key. So we'll go ahead and take the monitor down so that it reads 3.0, and we confirm that by hitting the button to the right of the arrow. The monitor asks us to reconfirm that we're using a 3.0 tube. We hit the button that corresponds to that, and now we're calibrated. The monitor is asking us the type of tube we're going to be using. It happens to be for this demonstration a Mallinckrodt, so I'll confirm that. And then we'll hook up the endotrach tube. The device is used, the sensor can be used to intubate a patient, or it can be used on a patient that's already been intubated. In either case, you want to make sure that the adapter that comes on whatever endotrach tube you're using is removed. Once you remove that adapter, you hook the end of the sensor up to that spot. In this case, we could go ahead and intubate if we wanted to, or we could wait and set the baseline on a patient after they had been intubated. The question from the monitor now is, are you going to use the previous baseline? There is no previous baseline because this is a new sensor. So we're going to say no. Now we're ready to go ahead and intubate the patient. In setting the baseline, which is the next step, we want to basically measure movement of the endotrach tube from wherever it is at the point in time we set the baseline. So I've gone ahead and intubated into a fake trachea now, and there's a green go sign that's indicating to me, are you ready to go or start monitoring? I'll hit that go button. The flashing 00 means to set the baseline. I hit it 2 more times, once to get the set baseline sign up and then to confirm it. Now the monitor is ready to measure movement of the tube. So if the tube starts to move more proximally or move towards the carina, you'll see the downward arrow will light up, indicating that we've moved closer to the carina. If I start to have the tube start to move towards extubation, you'll see the upward arrow will light, indicating that the tube is starting to migrate out of the trachea. And I can simply reset the baseline to where the placement was originally by going back to the 00. If for some reason an alarm happens, let's say because the tube started to extubate, the alarm will tend to sound as we get to, in this case, greater than a centimeter from the baseline. What you'll notice is as the alarm is sounding, you see the red light coming on here. If you happen to be at the bedside and you want to temporarily suspend the alarm, i.e. stop the sound, you do that by hitting this button over here, which temporarily for 2 minutes silences the alarm and lights an alarm silence button right here. At the end of 2 minutes, it'll default back to regular monitoring. If the alarm condition is still there, the alarm will obviously sound again. In some instances, you may want to connect things to the sensor other than the ventilator circuit. Obviously, the back end of the sensor is designed so that the ventilator circuit can be connected right here. We also have an adapter that can be added to the proximal end of the sensor that will allow an elbow or a Y adapter to be connected right here, so inline suction can be added, and then as you finish the rest of the circuit, be it flow sensors or end-tidal CO2 sensors, they could all be added on the back end of the sensor. The important thing in using the SonarMed airwave monitoring system is that the sensor be connected directly to the endotrach tube, and then this adapter would allow different plugs to be added to the back end of the sensor if you weren't going to connect the circuit up directly. There's 2 additional options that are available when you're setting up the SonarMed airwave monitoring system. The first would be to set the carina distance. Carina distance would show up in the lower part of this green box here. And the first thing we have to do is to determine how far the tip of the endotrach tube is from the carina, which would be done by examining a chest x-ray that had been taken post-intubation. So in this instance, we'll assume that the tip of the endotrach tube is ½ a centimeter away from the carina. The way we would enter that into the system is we would press the blue button to the right of the gear, and we would take the lower arrows down to set carina distance, and then hit the center to enter button. You can see right now it's telling us that the carina distance has not been set. We hit the increase button till we get to ½ a centimeter. We hit the center to enter button. Then we hit the return button, confirming that the carina distance is ½ a centimeter, the return button one more time to get to the monitoring screen. And now you can see that the carina distance has been set to ½ a centimeter. If the endotrach tube was to move closer to the carina, you will see that it will subtract that distance. As we go down 0.3 centimeters, you can see that this starts to adjust. Likewise, if the tube starts to move or migrate out of the trachea, you can see that we would be adding distance from the carina. Again, keeping in mind that you need a chest x-ray to confirm and determine what the distance is, and then we simply enter that into the system. The second thing we can do with the SonarMed airwave monitoring system on setup is to modify the length of the endotracheal tube. It's not uncommon for some neonatal intensive care units to cut or reduce the length of the endotrach tube, and we have to adjust the monitor when that's done. To do that, we hit the button to the right of the gear, use the downward arrow key to get to the Modify ET tube length. We hit the center to enter button. We'll now reduce this length to 15.8 centimeters. We hit the center to enter button again. We hit the return button. We tell the monitor to accept those changes and return back to the monitoring screen. At this point, the monitor has been adjusted for the ET tube length, and you can see that as the new length is displayed at the upper part of the monitor in the center, showing you that the tube has been reduced in length. So again, in the SonarMed airwave monitoring system, after you're calibrated, you can set the carina distance by manually entering what that distance is after you've measured it off of a post-intubation chest x-ray, and you can modify the length of the endotracheal tube if for some reason your unit chooses to cut the length of the tube so that the monitor knows exactly how long of a tube it's sending the signal through.